Hello and welcome to the Providence College Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Kay, and I'm joined by producer Chris Judge of the class of 2005. Here at the Providence College Podcast, we bring you interesting stories from the Fryer family. Today, we're talking with Dr. Katherine Lacasse, a member of the class of 2007 and an assistant professor of social psychology at Rhode Island College. She studies how performing green behaviors impacts people's self-perceptions and political attitudes regarding environmental issues. Katherine, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So can you tell us a little bit more about your research focus?
As you mentioned, a good amount of my research looks at environmental sustainability and, what does psychology have to say about environmental sustainability. So a lot of what I look at is when people do different things in their life to go green or to try to help the environment, how that can impact them in other ways. So some of my research has looked at when people start to do things like recycle or other small things in their life to go green, it can change the way they view themselves. They start to think of themselves as more of an environmentalist or a more environmentally friendly person. It can lead them to actually feel more moral obligation to help the environment. It sounds a little backwards, like I just did something to help the environment, but now I feel even more morally obligated. And it can also have an impact on their support for different environmental policies. So doing small things at home might lead you to be more supportive of things like renewable energy or electric cars or things like that.
It's almost like a chicken and egg question. Does recycling cause you to form these political beliefs, or do you already have the political beliefs which motivates you to recycle?
Yeah, what I would say is you're certainly right. It's probably can be looked at more of like a virtuous cycle. So, behaviors lead to attitudes, which then strengthens your attitudes, which might lead you to perform other behaviors later. So it certainly works that way. I focused a little bit more on looking at how behavior impacts attitudes, honestly, because it's not looked at as much. There's a lot of research looking at how people's beliefs or core values can impact whether they do different environmentally friendly behaviors. And I was just interested in looking at the other way around. Like once you get these actions started, if that could have an impact in the other direction.
It also seems like there'd be a lot of application. I mean, if governments or other organizations are trying to motivate people who may not necessarily have these inherent beliefs in them to try to get them to go forward and adopt some of these practices. And so, if there's a government policy, I know of communities where you have to pay for every bag of trash they pick up, but recycling is free. Mm-hmm. Is that the kind of thing that then could?
Yeah, I think that's one thing that environmental psychologists are interested in looking at. So that policy is a great example, right? Where it kind of nudges you into recycling because recycling is going to be cheaper than throwing everything out in the garbage if they charge for using garbage. And then you can reflect back on your past actions. It often helps if you point it out to people. People don't usually walk around thinking about all the environmentally friendly things they do. But if you ask them to reflect back on it and think about what they've done environmentally friendly in the past, that can kind of give them a little boost and lead them to think of themselves as more environmentally friendly. The other thing I would say, and this is I'm coming from the perspective, as you mentioned, of a social psychologist, and in social psychology, we're really interested how people influence each other, what's persuasive, what leads to behavior change. And so when you're thinking in terms of policies, I think, you can think about focusing on people's attitudes, like get them to care about the environment. But there's lots of other factors that go into people's behaviors too. So a good policy maybe would remove a lot of the barriers, the things that make it hard to do the behavior. So if you can make it easy for people, if you can present them with lots of options, of course, if you can make it cheaper for people, then they're going to be more likely to do it. And the other factor that really seems to matter a lot is what are all the other people around you doing? And so in terms of policy, if you create a policy where there's kind of more of a community movement towards doing something, where I'm doing something together with my neighbors, or where it's very clearly advertised if lots of other people are doing the same behavior, then that also seems to be helpful. So one example, I've been recently looking at things like residential solar adoption, people deciding to put solar on their roofs. And a lot of the a lot of the recent policies have focused on doing it community by community. There's a program called Solarize, where what they do is they come into a community and they have meetings, they answer all of the questions for people, they make it really easy to map people up with solar providers. If a big group of people from a community all does it together, it reduces the cost. And there's this community sense where everyone goes to meetings together, they're talking to their other neighbors who are interested in the same thing. And that can really help, both on the one hand of making it easier to go solar, and on the other hand of making it more of a social factor to see all the other people who want to go solar too.
You see people who are buying the sale pitches basically on why solar is a good plan, and other people are also motivated by that as well.
Yeah. I mean, part of it is, everyone who is interested in going solar probably doesn't know each other, but you get them all in one room and then they can all talk to each other. There's also some evidence, particularly from solar and other kinds of things like adopting, hybrid vehicles and things like that, just seeing a lot of it in your neighborhood, it can be a motivator to going that direction. It also just makes it seem easier. If I see lots of people around me have solar, or lots of people around me have a hybrid vehicle, it makes it seem like, oh, it's not that weird of a thing to do. Lots of other people can do it. I can probably do it too.
It establishes kind of a new norm.
Yeah.
I feel like this question came up when the Prius first came on the market and was such a distinctive looking vehicle that I think people kind of reacted to it like as a negative aesthetic. That they didn't think it was an attractive car, but all of a sudden it's become a status symbol. It's a way to wear environmentalism like in the parking lot.
Yeah, exactly. So, any kind of visible environmentalism probably has the risk of going both ways, right? So if it's very boldly environmental, it has the potential to turn some people off, but it also has the potential to at least make everyone else around you recognize that this environmental thing is happening.
So tell us a little bit about what inspired you to pursue this sort of research.
One thing I would say is that, and this is probably true of a lot of other social scientists who study environmental issues, is, I didn't get into this necessarily just because I love the environment. Like, I like trees, I like animals, they're great. But mostly I got interested in environmental issues because of the negative impact that they have on people. If you're thinking about problems like water pollution or climate change, they're having negative impacts on people across the globe. Even in local communities, you can see a lot of the impacts of those problems. And maybe the positive twist on it is that most environmental problems are caused by human behavior. And psychologists, we're really good at studying that. We study motivations, we study behavior change. And so it seemed like a place where, I could do research, I could be helpful to try to solve these problems, and they do seem solvable if you can get, again, individual people to change their behavior, and also if you can learn about what are the best ways to design policies and things to have larger scale impacts.
Let's talk a little bit about scale, because I feel like that is one of the challenges when talking about environmental issues, is that, the ozone layer is disappearing, the polar ice caps are melting, but what's is my changing my air conditioner setting to, a couple of degrees, is that really going to make an impact? And
it's a very good point. And as psychologists, that's one of the downsides. We tend to focus on individual people and look at, what are all the different things that alter that individual person's perspective. I think that within psychology, there's a lot of focus on that, but there's really been a push to try to focus more on big picture. So part of the reason why I started looking at, what impacts people's political attitudes, what impacts their likelihood of supporting policies, was due to what you just mentioned, doing things at the individual level. If you get a large group of people doing things at the individual level, that certainly can make a difference. But, one person doing one thing at the individual level probably doesn't. But if those individual things people are doing in their homes might lead them to be more supportive of larger scale policy changes that are going to have a big impact, then maybe it is worth looking at those little things that people are doing at home.
Definitely some of those conversations about whether or not plastic straws are valuable in the environment, plastic bags, it's going to change your day-to-day life, but it'll have, we've been talking about the impact, plastic in the oceans, trash in the oceans.
Yeah. And that might be a good example where, again, a few people trying hard to use less plastic maybe won't make a big impact, but if entire states take, move forward in ways that are really going to be reducing at a large scale the amount of plastic, it might matter. Also, I mean, one interesting thing that is worth looking at is that sometimes when policies change, it actually alters the way people think about things. So, for example, this isn't from the environmental literature, this is more from the health literature, but when bans in different states were passed on smoking, so reducing the places you could smoke. You can't smoke in restaurants, you can't smoke in these different places. Once those bans were passed, people actually started thinking about smoking differently. They thought it was more dangerous for you than they thought it was before. They thought it was less socially acceptable than they thought it was before. And so you could imagine with environmental policies such as, maybe you're only banning plastic bags, but that's starting to get everyone to think a little bit more about plastic. Like, plastic really is a bad thing. We're banning it for this one reason, and it might start expanding their thoughts and ideas about plastic in general. So I could see, again, even policies only aimed at small amounts of things could start to alter like the kind of public consciousness to start thinking more thoughtfully about plastic, for example.
It seems like seatbelts might be another comparison.
Exactly. I'm less familiar with the specific research on seatbelts, but certainly there's this point where if everyone's doing it, then all of a sudden it makes it seem very important if lots of people are doing it.
Right, and that changes sort of the norm and the community norm.
Certainly.
I'm curious with the weather we've been having this summer in Rhode Island, if you have seen in your subjects any sort of cognitive dissonance, sort of, when we have a really awful winter and we have tons of snow, do you see people reacting differently about
Yeah, there certainly is a lot of, and again, I don't know at the individual level how much variability, but there's a lot of evidence that, if you ask people about climate change when it's hot, they're a lot more concerned than if you ask them about climate change when it's cold. There's actually some mixed evidence looking at like extreme weather events. And so one of the recent research projects I was working on was actually a collaborative project working with climate modelers and geographers and mathematicians to try to see if, as the climate continues to change and if there's more extreme weather events, if that might have an impact on people's behaviors. Are they going to start noticing these extreme weather events and say, hey, I got to take this seriously and start reducing emissions? The research looking at that is a little bit mixed. There is some evidence that if people experience floods or hurricanes or, like, for example, the wildfires out in California that have been exacerbated by drought from climate change, those things do make people show a bit more concern about things like climate change or other environmental issues after they've experienced that extreme event. But it also seems that people who are already environmentally concerned are the ones who are the most impacted. So if you already are concerned about climate change and then you experience an extreme event, you're like, aha, look, there it was. And if you weren't all that concerned about environmental issues, you're not necessarily going to interpret a flood as being due to climate change. So it really depends on if the events are matched up in your mind with environmental problems.
So it kind of sounds like you're saying it reinforces the beliefs you already have.
Yeah, and I'd say there's certainly a good amount of evidence that one hurricane isn't going to change everybody's mind. As well, it probably shouldn't. So,
right. I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about your path to your research from Providence College. Was there anything about your experience here that?
So I was a psychology major at Providence College, and I started taking psychology classes right from the beginning. I couldn't get enough. As I mentioned, I was really interested in social psychology because I was interested in how people influence each other and, where our behavior really comes from, and thinking about how external forces have an impact on people. And I was focusing on social psychology, but then during my senior year, I took a few environmentally oriented classes. They weren't in psychology, they weren't in a social science. One was in a chemistry department where we spent a lot of time thinking about how actual chemical elements are related to the greenhouse gas effect and how CO2 can really thicken the blanket and lead to climate change. And I took another class on environmental ethics, which I think really helped create the link for me that these environmental problems really are an ethical problem, and that, they're hurting people, and that we need to do things to try to address those problems. So I was already kind of taking a psychology path, and all of a sudden I learned about all these environmental things that were interesting. And so I was really able to combine the two things once I reached graduate school, looking at, as I mentioned, how people change their behavior and how you can, understand what leads to different environmental behaviors and things like that.
Very neat. What are you studying now? What kind of questions are you looking at?
So as I mentioned, one of my recent projects was looking at, how people's perceptions of extreme weather events might change their behavior and actually feed back into hopefully reducing their emissions, and looking at how we could actually link those psychological processes to a climate model. A lot of, there are different climate models, but most of them are very focused on natural processes. They connect the ocean to the atmosphere to the earth, and they look at how all these connections are going to lead to future planet warming. And one group I'm working with is really trying to say, hey, we really need to bring the human behavioral piece in here. As things change, we don't want to expect that humans are just going to respond in the same way over and over again. We expect that people might change how they act in response to a warming climate. And so that's one project that I've been working on. Another project that I'm trying to get off the ground right now is looking at people's interest in adopting solar panels here in Rhode Island. So I mentioned solar panels earlier. That's why I've been looking into that a lot. And also looking at people's interest in possibly participating in a community solar program. So one that requires a little bit less investment, where the community owns a patch of solar panels and you kind of invest into that without having to make all the decisions yourself and put everything up on your house. It seems these are rather new. They do exist in some states. Sometimes they're called community solar gardens, which sounds very nice. And Rhode Island is in the process of trying to get some of those started. And so we wanted to look at, what might distinguish whether people have a preference for putting the solar on their own home or joining a community program. So that's one of the projects I'm working on trying to get started right now.
Interesting. It seems like there would be a lot of variables in your own home versus a garden that...
Yeah. One of our theories is that, on the one hand, if people are really interested in furthering the investment on their home, and certainly income is going to be a big predictor here. If they have the money to install the solar panels and they want to make that investment on their home, or if they're, really into technology, and then those people might be more likely to prefer to actually put the solar panels on their own home. Whereas we think, if people feel are more interested in the community aspect of doing it together with a group of people, and also people who aren't able to put solar on their own home. So renters, for example, the community solar might give them an option to still participate in renewable energy, even though they don't have the ability to really make those kinds of large scale decisions on their own homes.
I'm curious if there's any faculty or other experiences here at PC that you really stand out in your mind now that you're, leading classrooms yourself.
Yes. I would say, when I was here at Providence College, there was quite a few professors that I worked with closely. Father Guido was my advisor, and he was amazing, and he really very strongly helped guide me on the path towards applying to grad school and getting into grad school. It was really very overwhelming, and he was very helpful and supportive in doing that. I worked as a teaching assistant for a few years with Dr. Lamb, who I understand is retired now, but working as a teaching assistant for statistics, which was very helpful, again, in getting into grad school, having to do statistics over and over and over again. I knew it like the back of my hand. And then also, I had quite a few courses with Dr. O'Keefe. And again, she helped me learn all my research methods. She was always focused on, how can we take psychology and apply it in meaningful ways. I took a health psychology class with her, so thinking about how do all these things we learn about impact people's health, and how can we use these things to understand health. So I really appreciated that perspective of, there's a lot of utility in, doing psychology in the lab and just keeping it in the lab, but I always wanted to get out there and apply it in the field. And so I think she was inspiring in that way.
I feel like there's a lot of alumni. We've been talking this year with a couple of alums from the psychology department as they've celebrated their 50th anniversary, and I feel like there's a lot of alums who would agree with you very strongly about the names you've mentioned.
Okay.
Lots of fans of Dr. O'Keefe and Father Guido and Dr. Lamb out there for certain.
Okay.
I'm curious, you tell us a little bit more about your experience at PC. What else were you involved in?
So, I was involved in a few things on campus. I was on the rugby team for about 3 years. So that was really fun. We were Division II, and we actually went to nationals twice, which was a really fun experience, going out to Ohio, going out to California to support the women's rugby team. And I was also a DJ at WDOM. I did a 90s rock show at like 10 a.m. on a Sunday. So I don't know how well listened it was, but I had a lot of fun putting it on and bringing my friends in the studio and doing that. Yeah.
So you're a stranger to the headphones.
No. I haven't done it in a while though. Kind of miss it. You leave college and you're like, oh, I can't just be a DJ anymore.
There's no one who's going to give you airtime? Come on.
Yeah.
Well, I wondered if there was any experiences, you could talk about what it's like to be in the front of the classroom now, looking back on your experience at PC.
I mean, I think one thing that was very beneficial was, going to Providence College. We spent so much time writing. It was like writing. Every class, you have to write a paper, you have to go through several drafts. And I found that really helpful when I'm teaching specifically writing, really thinking about how to organize writing, that you need to go through several drafts and get feedback, that no one's going to write a perfect 20-page paper the first time through. And so that, understanding that all of those steps are needed. I really think I learned that. Maybe it had to be beaten to my head a little bit, but after writing so many papers, I learned that was important, and I've certainly taken that into the classroom. The other thing I think that's really helpful is, being at PC is a kind of, it's a small campus and you actually really get to know all the faculty. So a lot of the people I mentioned, I had more than one class with them. And so being able to build that kind of relationship with students, I found really important when I was here, of really getting to know the faculty members and really feeling like, they cared about me and they knew what was going on with my career plan. And so I bring that now over to Rhode Island College. One of the things I do there is I work as the internship coordinator. So I spend a lot of time sitting down with psych majors one-on-one and saying, what do you want to do after graduation, and what kinds of things do you want to prepare now so that you can move on and achieve that goal when you graduate. And I'd say that's one of the most fun parts about my job right now, is really getting to meet with students one-on-one, get to know what they want to do, and try to advise them and help them along their way.
Sort of coaching.
Yeah, exactly. It's different from being like, you need to learn this material. This is, it's a little bit more personal and a little bit more, I think I get to be pretty creative there.
Do you find yourself drawing on your social psychology background in these relationships and in the classroom?
Yes, certainly. I think one of the most, as I said, a lot of things that social psychologists study are behavior change, and the most effective ways to design something so that you can lead people to take whatever the new action is. And so I think a lot of it is all about how you design something. So it could be, maybe in the classroom when you're designing an assignment, you, for example, don't just have one big 20-page paper due at the end of the semester. Set it up so that, people are going to be doing lots of steps along the way, so that they're not just writing a 20-page paper the day beforehand. Have them do lots of assignments leading up to it so that they're working on it throughout the whole semester. It could be for something as simple as, if you want people to log on to the textbook and take an online quiz, you should make it really easy for them. Like show them step by step how to do it, show them where the login information is, make everything very available, and make sure that you as a professor are available to answer questions. And, each semester I figure out, where was the problem, where were people having difficulty, and I can add a little tweak, add a little nudge to my class each time to make it easier for students to, again, complete their assignments and read the textbook and do all the things that are really just going to help them do better overall in the class and learn more.
And you're not a native New Englander. What brought you to Providence College?
So I'm originally from Florida, from outside the Orlando area, and that's where I grew up. But my parents are originally from New England. So when I was graduating high school, I was rebellious and I wanted to go as far away as possible. I was like, I need to get away from Florida. And so my parents were like, okay, well then go to New England where you've got relatives. And so, I applied to Providence College and I was really excited to get in. Again, I wanted to have that kind of small school feel, which a lot of Florida colleges, there's a lot of really good colleges in Florida, but they tend to be very large, like University of Florida and University of Central Florida. So I was happy to come to a small school. I was actually very excited about the Civ program. I was like, oh, I get to read everything about everything across all of time. I mean, it probably was not that extensive, but it sounded very exciting coming in. So yeah, I moved up here, and then I've been in the New England area ever since. I went to graduate school in Worcester, Massachusetts, and I was very excited when I got the job at Rhode Island College and was able to move back to Providence. My husband and I both love Providence, Rhode Island.
Thank you so much, Katherine, for joining us today. Subscribe to the Providence College Podcast in all the usual places, including iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Google Play. If you like what you hear, please review and share with others. Thanks for listening, and go Friars.